Tonight we are going to listen to a talk delivered by the Reverend Dr. Shepherd from Alice. Dr. Shepherd was for 15 years chaplain at Lovedale. For the following 14 years he was principal of Lovedale, and for 31 years he was director of the Lovedale Press, and for a corresponding period he was editor of the Outlook. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Shepherd.
Thank you so much for your welcome. I feel that you've had a double obituary tonight. My subject is the literary historical landmarks of Alison district. Visitors to the border who are acquainted with its history seldom fail to comment on the wealth of historical landmarks to be found in the vicinity of the Chumé Valley. This could hardly fail to be the case when so much of the conflict between the old and the new masters of South Africa took place between the Fish and the Keiskamma rivers. Along with this historical wealth, it is not so commonly known that there came to be an output of literature of a notable kind, much of it inspired by the historical events that made the district so famous. I would like this evening to bring these two, the historical and the literary, together. I would have given the title to this lecture, The Literary Historical Associations of Alison District, but I wish to avoid any idea that I was to give you an account of the literary and historical societies that had flourished and faded. I will concentrate on the literary landmarks or associations, but you will see how closely they are linked to historical events. I propose to divide our subject into three main sections. And first, missionary literature, including a section on the development of the local African vernacular. Second, the tales of travellers. And third, creative literature. There is missionary literature of a dull and uninviting kind, but there is also that which is of the highest value to the historian and the anthropologist. Of the latter we have an astonishing abundance. I do not intend to dwell on sources, but I would like to mention how it was my good fortune to find in a cupboard in a Lovedale library 2 bound volumes of missionary magazines published in Edinburgh in 1800 and 1801, and to discover in them the printed letters of Dr. Vanderkemp, the first missionary to the Bantu. Letters written in the district between the Keiskamma and the Buffalo in the years 1799 and 1800. Johannes Theodorus Vanderkemp, a philosopher and medical doctor of Holland, trained in medicine in Edinburgh, offered himself for service with the London Missionary Society of 1799. It is interesting to recall that the one with whom he corresponded on the matter was the secretary of the society, the Reverend Dr. John Love, after whom Lovedale was named. You must never think that Lovedale was chosen for any romantic connection. Vanderkemp, who came of a good family and might have attained to high government position in his native land, did nothing by halves. He was hot-blooded, clever, scornful of the mob, a rebel against convention, the champion of the underprivileged. It was this man, proficient in 16 languages, who at the age of 50 offered to become a missionary and was designated for service at the Cape. For some cause which I cannot explain, unless it was through the influence of Dr. Love, then minister of the Scotch Church in London, Vanderkemp, before leaving Britain, was ordained a minister of the Church of Scotland through an agent of the London Society. He travelled along with 3 missionary companions from England to Cape Town on the ship Hillsborough, which carried a mutinous lot of 300 convicts bound for Botany Bay. The convicts were mostly bound in irons and were kept in the darkness of the orlop or lower deck. 34 of them died on the 15 weeks' voyage to the Cape, and others were landed at Cape Town without hope of recovery. Vanderkemp and his companions spent 7 weeks in Cape Town and devoted themselves to the spiritual help of the slaves, who form more than half of Cape Town's population. Of the slaves and their environment, Vanderkemp pungently declared that many are evidently baptized with the Holy Ghost and with fire, though the customs of this country do not allow them to be baptized with water. In May 1799, he set out on his journey to the Eastern Colony, a journey that is one of the romances of missionary travel, and the record of which provides a vivid picture of the land as it was nearly 150, or rather more than 150 years ago. At last, after many adventures, he reached the valley and met Chief Ngika, Gaika as we Europeans call him, by the side of the Chume. Thereafter, for 15 months, Vanderkemp wandered through this part of the country, meeting with little success in his missionary labours, though he baptized at least one Hottentot woman in the Keiskamma River. The land was unsettled by war. The governor forbade any of his companions to join him. The Hottentots with whom he resided and who supplied his wants finally determined to forsake Xhosa territory. And so on the last day of the year 1800, Vanderkemp made his exit by way of the east, and going round by what came to be known as the Piri Mountains, forsook this part of the land. The remainder of his life was spent principally at Bethelsdorp near Port Elizabeth and in Cape Town, where he died in 1811. The story of Vanderkemp, as told in his letters and journal, and as set out in the modern biography of A.D. Martin, must be one of perpetual interest. After Vanderkemp, no missionary came over the Fish River for 14 years, since it was the settled policy of the government to have whites and blacks dwelling in separate areas. But in 1815, the rule was relaxed, and in July 1816, there took up residence at the Cat River, close to where Fort Beaufort now stands, the Reverend Joseph Williams, another LMS missionary. To Williams will ever remain the distinction of being the first missionary to bring his wife and family to dwell among the Eastern Bantu. His wife, who seems to have been a woman of no common power, kept a journal, and selections from it were afterwards published in Dr. John Phillips' famous book, Researches in South Africa, which appeared in 1828, and was the cause of the notable ordinance published in the same year with a view to improving the conditions of the Hottentots. In the midst of a wild and warlike people, the new missionary set himself to build a house and schoolroom, to clear land for a garden, and to construct with great labour a dam for leading out the water of the Cat River for irrigation. At the end of a year, Mrs. Williams could record that nearly 150 people were now living at the mission and receiving Christian teaching. But the light that had begun to shine was soon extinguished. In 1818, 2 years after he had come, Williams died, worn out and disheartened. The simple record kept by his wife of his last days is one of the most moving of documents. She says, August 20th, 1818. This morning the fever had much increased. He got out of bed quite wild, but through weakness was obliged to lie down again. In the course of the day the people came to me, requesting that I would send into the colony to let my friends know that Mr. Williams lay so ill. I told them I had not permission from government to send Kaffirs into the colony. They pressed hard, saying that I was there, a lone woman, with my 2 little children, and my husband so ill. It was too hard for them. They could not bear it. August 23rd. This morning, just as day began to break, his happy spirit took flight, to be forever with the Lord. She then records that she began to teach the Bantu how to make her husband's coffin and dig the grave. Why I emphasize these details you will presently learn. She had some difficulty in persuading them to make the coffin, for they knew not how to go about it. But she directed them as well as she could, and then they willingly set to work. The coffin was not finished till the next day, and she and the children spent a large part of the intervening night in the same room as the body. When the coffin was completed, 4 native or Hottentot young men put the corpse into the coffin. Mrs. Williams concludes, I then took my 2 fatherless infants by the hand, and followed by the remains of my beloved husband to the grave, accompanied by the whole of the people and the children. When they had put the body in the grave, I requested them to sing a hymn, after which we prayed. In a field about 3 miles beyond Fort Beaufort, on the road to Catburg, may be seen a massive tombstone set up at the time of the centenary of his death to mark the grave of Williams. The word Cossa on it is almost unrecognizable, so bad is the spelling, and the date of death is wrongly given. But worst of all, in the vicinity and in other parts of South Africa lingers the myth that in the hour of her need the Bantu people would give no help to Mrs. Williams, so that she had to make the coffin and bury her husband with her own hands. This tale is frequently found in South African history books, and it was repeated to me personally in a farmhouse about a mile from the grave. Yet Mrs. Williams' journal, published 130 years ago, proves how utterly unfounded such a version is. I had the great good fortune to have handed to me as a gift for Lovedale 2 unique volumes. They contain the annual reports of the Glasgow Missionary Society from the year when the first Scottish missionaries came to South Africa in 1821 till the society was dissolved in 1844. The early missionaries wrote voluminously, not only in annual reports but in quarterly papers, which were also printed. The latter contained many of their letters in full. The Reverend John Ross, who arrived in the Chumie Valley in 1823, preserved these reports and quarterly papers and had them bound in 2 large volumes. Their hundreds of pages give full accounts of the labours of the earliest Scottish missionaries, describe in detail the climatic conditions and geographical features of the country a century and more ago, the African people and their customs, political happenings, the opening ceremony of Lovedale Institution, the fear of the Bantu of an eclipse of the sun in 1824, and so on and so on. A whole lecture could be devoted to these volumes. A treasured possession of Lovedale is the manuscript journal kept by the Reverend James Lane, Lang, I believe he's usually named, but we Scots people say Lane, who spent 40 years as a missionary. His work was done at Burns Hill, but for 12 years, from 1843 till 1855, he was stationed at Lovedale itself. An intimate friend was the Reverend William Govan, the first principal of Lovedale, who after his retirement in 1870 and Lane's death in 1872 took the journal in which Lane had faithfully recorded his day-to-day experiences at Burns Hill and Lovedale and wove the material into a volume with the title The Memorials of the Reverend James Lane, a title which does not do justice to the great historical value of the contents. I may mention in passing that we have given our historical documents, letters, and so on to the Corey Library in Grahamstown, and on semi-permanent loan. I hope it will be permanent loan. And they are all housed in one room and open for research. Another missionary volume of special interest is the biography of the Reverend T. Soga by John A. Channers. Professor Hernley of Johannesburg claimed at one time that this was the first full-length biography of anyone South African born, black or white, but a more diligent search of Mendelssohn led him to qualify that statement. Nevertheless, it is one of the first of such biographies, and he, like his biographer Channers, was born at Chume, some 10 miles from where Lovedale now is. He was born in 1829. He entered Lovedale Institution in 1844. Later was trained in Scotland for the ministry, and in time became the first thoroughly educated and ordained African missionary to his own people. And in 1955, Lovedale had only 5 principals. Mr. Govan for 29 years, Dr. Stewart for 35 years, Dr. Henderson for 25, Dr. Wilkie for 10, and myself for 15. Criticism in certain sections of the public press of South Africa of the value of native education led Dr. Stewart to execute one of his master strokes. He determined to compile a register which would furnish accounts of the afterlife of as many Lovedale pupils as could be found. The result was Lovedale Past and Present, a book of nearly 700 pages, giving brief biographies of some 2,000 Africans and 400 Europeans who, from 1841 till 1886, had come to Lovedale for education. The title page bore the caption, "A record written in black and white, but more in white than black," and it was added, "It is nothing if it is not true." So true was it that if a pupil was known to have been convicted in a law court, the fact was duly recorded in the book. What made the volume memorable in a literary sense was the introduction, written in Dr. Stewart's marvellously clear and incisive style, and there were few authors able to write English as he was at that time. In it he dealt with the common arguments against the education of Africans. His arguments hold today, and little more can be added to them. The book received nationwide attention, and one of the Dutch newspapers declared that as an answer to the objections made by cavillers, it was simply unanswerable. Other missionary volumes of unusual interest, their names are legion, might be mentioned. One is George Brown's Personal Adventure in South Africa, a book written after the author's nerve-wracking experience in Chume Valley in the massacres of Christmas Day, 1850, and which is pervaded by extreme bitterness against the Bantu, and Brownley's reminiscences of Kafir life and history. But the number of books on African affairs of a century and more ago are simply legion. Perhaps I should mention, as a literary association of a different kind, that the original seminary at Lovedale cost £940 to build, and that part of the sum required for its erection was obtained from the handsome royalties received through the publication about 1840 of a second edition of the letters of Dr. John Love, after whom, as already mentioned, Lovedale was named. Very unusual thing for a minister's letters to bring a royalty of £200. The Alice district also has the distinction of being the one in which one of the outstanding African languages, Xhosa, was first reduced to writing and the beginning of a literature. A missionary who rendered outstanding service in this connection was John Benny, who came to the Chume Valley under the auspices of the Glasgow Missionary Society in 1821. In the following year he wrote that even in his native Scotland he could not enjoy the happiness which he had from the study of a language yet unwritten. He speaks of his task as reducing to form and rule this language which hitherto floated in the wind. It is significant that another early task of this man, who was a born linguist, was to learn Dutch, because a number of the Bantu as well as the Hottentots in the vicinity had been in touch with Dutch settlers. Within a few months, Benny was proficient in Dutch and was able to converse and teach in it. At the same time, he was diligently employed in acquiring Xhosa. 4 months after coming to Chume, he wrote, "I scarcely know what to say about the language. The attainment of it will certainly be a most difficult task, but to the poor people it is of great importance. We are much in want of proper assistance. We will, however, lay the foundation as well as we can on which future missionaries may build, and we have a few stones already collected. For we have got a little way with our vocabulary. I have got the children in a school to repeat in their native language the Lord's Prayer, a morning prayer, 30 short questions, a part of the Creed, a doxology, and part of the 23rd Psalm, the whole of which we have translated." I found in a case in the public library in Cape Town a copy of this printed little book. And if ever I was tempted to break the 10th commandment, it was when a librarian opened the case and let me examine it in his absence. All this within 4 months of his coming, and while handling a language never before reduced to writing. Of the language he says again, "It is a fine, soft, agreeable language, and uncommonly musical," though he admits he has difficulty with what he called the clacks. We call them the clicks. Benny's language work, and that of the other missionaries, was greatly aided when the Reverend John Ross arrived in 1823, bringing with him a small printing press. After getting the press to Cape Town by ship, he brought it overland by wagon and came to Chume on the 16th of December 1823. This was easily the earliest press to come so far east. Benny wrote to Dr. Love on the date 20th December. On the 17th we got our press in order. On the 18th the alphabet was set up, and yesterday we threw off 50 copies. Through your instrumentality, a new era has commenced in the history of the Kaffir nation. He spoke even more truly than he knew. The printing press at Chume early printed a little elementary spelling book, a small catechism, and so on. But the rendering of the scriptures into Xhosa was the missionary's paramount task. In this work, far-seeing views prevailed. So early as 1825 it was declared, aware of the importance of an accurate version and of the difficulty of translating such a pure spiritual volume as the Bible into the language of a people conversant only about material objects, they have resolved to exercise the most vigilant caution before they commit their version to the press. The work of one is examined separately and successively by them all. Mistakes which otherwise might have escaped the eye of the most careful are thus corrected. Useful discussions upon the language are promoted, and the translation, when it comes forth, will be stamped in the eyes of the natives and of the world with the name and authority of the whole institution. Missionaries of the Methodist, London and Glasgow societies met at Buffalo, later King Williamstown, in 1830 for the purpose of fixing rules for writing the language. They took John Benny's system as the basis. It is impossible within the limits of this paper to tell how language and literature in the local African vernacular were developed. Important events were the publication of the first Xhosa magazine, Ikwezi, the Morning Star, at Chumé in 1844. I knew about these 4 magazines, but never hoped that I'd be able to get them until one day copies were handed to me. The publication of the whole Bible, Appleyard's version, in 1865, the publication of Theo Soga's wonderful translation of the first part of Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress in 1867, and Dr. Croft's Xhosa Dictionary in 1900. The position today is that according to a survey made by the International Committee on Christian Literature for Africa, there are now more publications in Xhosa than in any other African language, with the sole exception of Swahili. Xhosa has proved to be a pioneer in works of a biographical and historical nature, and African authors have developed a distinct talent in the penning of the novel. The demand for literature is evidenced by the fact that while the Lovedale Press, which is a direct descendant of the Chumé Press of 1823, sold of its own publications in 1932 43,000 copies of books, the total each year now is about 500,000. Most of these books are in the vernacular, and many of them bear the marks of the editorial gifts of Mr. W.G. Benny, Dr. W.G. Benny, as he was the grandson of John Benny of early fame. And now we turn to the